Great. Thanks very much, Mara, everyone. I appreciate the introduction and the collaboration between the Bloomfield Public Library and the Winterberry Historical Society and everyone who's here with us today. I'm going to share my screen, get this rolling here. And what I've lined up today is I have a book in progress. It is still not done. I've been working on this book for more than a decade now. I've gotten other books written while working on this book. But the book is called On the Line: How Schooling, Housing, and Civil Rights Shaped Hartford and its Suburbs. And today I'm going to be emphasizing the Bloomfield portions of the chapters. The slides I'm showing, which is just a few of those, but they have important links to parts of the book. That's all available here. And even if you're not a Twitter user, the link works publicly. So I'll just click on it here to demo. You could just click on this link here, twitter.com, and then my last name, Dougherty, Jack, and it will show you a page where you can you could share with other people the link for today and sort of the slides we're using. So it's just helping you to make these resources useful to others. I'm going to go back and forth between a couple slides here and then actually the body of this book, which is an entirely online book. I'm slow at getting it all pulled together, but I've made a commitment, and thanks to my open access publisher, our contract with the Amherst College Press, they allow us to share all of the contents of the book entirely online, even while we're still working on it. The goal of this book, broadly stated, is very much trying to make visible the hidden boundary lines, especially schooling and housing boundary lines that have divided the metropolitan Hartford region, especially over the past 120 years, and very much the stories of activists and everyday families who've been trying to cross over, redraw, or erase these lines. Many of the people on the call today, I recognize some names, and some people I'm already familiar with, some people are new to me, but there's a lot of people with personal connections to these stories. I'm so glad you're joining us. I'll be showing some excerpts of this book in progress that I've created with Trinity College students and University of Connecticut students and faculty over time. And it's very much a historical narrative with digital maps and video clips woven into the online book. So we actually call this a digital first book. It's being created to primarily share on the web, which is why I'm sharing it with you now. And when it's finished, there will be a print paperback inexpensive version of it as well for people who prefer to read the text just in print. But the best version of it, with all of the interactive maps and video clips, will always be the online version that will always be open access. So I'm just going to bounce over to there right now. And I'll be flipping back and forth. So this is what the open access version of the book looks like. And that link, as I just showed you, is just OnTheLine.trincoll.edu if you're just trying to follow along in any parts of the book here. The way to think about this book here is every time I'm doing an update, and you can see the last update was back in July. The updates are always public here on the web while we're working on the book. And just give you a sense here more about authors and contributors. I'm the lead author on this, but there's been easily a dozen or more students and alumni who've worked with me over the years to create the content for chapters in the book, for interactive maps, and conducting oral history interviews. And also I was privileged to work with, for a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, a wonderful team of students and staff at the University of Connecticut Map and Geographic Information Center when we launched this project here. I'm slow on this one, but that's because while writing this book, I ended up writing 3 other books with co-authors sometimes to help explain the process of sort of like what it means to tell history in the digital age and share a lot of this on the web, often with interactive charts and maps. So that's some of what's going on behind the scenes there. And to keep me honest today, Mary, I've asked you to sort of like, time me in, it's like 25 minutes from now. I want you to definitely give me a stop signal at say 3:35 or so. I'm going to give just a half-hour overview of what are some portions of this book, the broad argument, and some specific portions that are relevant for an audience that's specifically interested in Bloomfield's history. And I'll go to these portions of the book, and then very much afterwards, I've got 30 minutes set aside for Q&A and comments and discussion, because there's a lot of expertise on the call right now, but people who know parts of Bloomfield history better than I will ever know. You've lived portions of this, or you've seen I've got my pad of paper so that afterwards I can jot down some ideas. And that's why I share this unfinished book in progress. It gets better whenever I do a talk like this and people give me constructive feedback and ideas and leads on new sources that may be incorporated into the book itself. Okay. So let's get started here. I'm going to jump to this first chapter here about defining city and suburban lines. Let me just go there. And if I try to tell people a story about anything about cities and suburbs, I'm always working with, for example, my Trinity College undergraduates have very rigid ideas of what cities and suburbs are like because of the time they've grown up in now. I often have to work with my younger readers to help sort of like challenge their preconceptions of what cities and suburbs are by going back in time and reminding people that if you go back certainly to the Gilded era of the 1860s and 70s and 80s, Hartford was known nationally as the richest city in the United States. You can see that in sort of the publications that were at the time. Scribner's Monthly had a whole article about this. We digitized and inserted into the book. And although this was a lot of local city boosterism as well, there was an argument for how people calculated and argued that Hartford was the richest city when they looked at the total amount of wealth, not individual median income like we do it today, but total wealth from businesses and corporations that were concentrated in Hartford with its insurance and manufacturing industry. But by the end of the 20th century, people are familiar with this today, that richest city slogan was turned upside down. And certainly in the year 2000, we had a number of stories about the decay of the famous once richest city that had moved on to one of the poorest cities in the United States as defined by the US Census Bureau. So how did it go? How did we get from one place to another? Where did that money go? And I often start with my students and help them understand that, well, if you were to look at an interactive map of where the money was, just in terms of home values, average assessed home values, how that changed over time. In 1910, a lot of that wealth in terms of home value per capita was concentrated in Hartford and West Hartford. And most of the areas around the city were very much rural communities, a couple of mill towns or so forth, but certainly the wealth was concentrated in the city at the time. And on our interactive maps, I always tell people, well, follow, where does the money go? So if we click forward here and just see where does the dark green go, as we go up through the 1940s and 50s and 60s and 70s, up closer to today, and we can see, oh, clearly the money's still in the metropolitan area, but a lot of that wealth, as determined by home values, has moved into suburban areas, areas such as in the Glastonbury area on this side here, or in the Farmington Valley area with Avon in the dark green and Farmington and Simsbury and the others. So making sense of how the money changed and shifted and why is a good way to start to think about how these lines got reshaped over time and the factors that affected this all the way through. Also early on, I try to get people to understand that the boundaries that we're used to today for the 169 towns that define Connecticut and very much its political structure, these boundaries, they may seem rigid to us today, but these are boundaries that people created over time. Another type of map I create here sort of shows if we scroll up from the 1600s, when Connecticut was settled as 3 large river colonies, Windsor, Hartford, and Wethersfield, you can see, and I'll just flip through this very quickly, as time goes by, settlers and colonial settlers are carving up the town boundaries. Doing this very much to in case with religion, because since there was a requirement that most families are participating in the state church at the time, they're getting a dispensation to create their own a church boundary, their congregational church boundary that they can get to on a cold, wintry day. So if you just look at this over time, those very rigid boundaries that we're used to today, you start realizing, oh, these were created and carved, towns were carved out of other towns over time. And even going up here into the 1830s, here we get to Bloomfield. And we can see Bloomfield was carved out of Windsor and Farmington and Simsbury, hence that Wintonbury name that you're familiar with today. So this has been helpful also to help people understand boundaries are created by people, we can also think about how we might want to modify boundaries over time as well. I'm going to jump ahead to a section here about segregating along color lines. Certainly the racial segregation that we see in the metropolitan Hartford area today, how did we get there and what caused it? I often start off by helping people see, well, what happens if you make a census map and instead of just looking at one period in time, what if we look at racial change over time? Now, this is challenging because our categories of race are socially constructed. Plain English means that people have created different labels, and these are politically contested labels of who belongs in what category. That's changed over time. But if I just take one category, such as how people have defined white citizens over time, at least how the Census Bureau has done this, and if we start in 1900 and just flip through the years again, we can see racial change happening as non-white citizens, often African Americans, in the later years, Puerto Ricans and others, were forced to live, if they're moving the area, only primarily in the northeast section of Hartford, with some in Windsor and Simsbury. And then we can see by the later in decades here, we have sizable percentages growing, but only in some inner ring suburbs, such as Bloomfield, such as Windsor, such as East Hartford, Manchester, New Britain. And when we get to the maps that look like where we're at today, many people start realizing, well, why does it look that way? Certainly people see, oh, I would see that there's a spread moving outward of people of color moving into housing opportunities that happen outside of the center city. But certainly that spread is not equal in all directions. We certainly see there's some areas, some towns that have a much wider population, even though their proximity is very close to the city center. So why is it, in plain English, why are some suburbs have more people of color residing there than others is a big question that people certainly ask about and try to understand. And that's partly what my book is trying to unpack. So on the housing side, let's go there for a minute. I'm going to jump into just a couple sections here about federal lending and redlining. There's been federal policies that were created by our government in collaboration with our local banks that, especially in the 1930s depression, when people are trying to jumpstart the housing economy, very much there's an effort to sort of like, how can the federal government try to get private investors to put more money into certain neighborhoods? And the way this was done is what we call them today were the redlining maps. Here's the one that shows West Hartford and Hartford. There's another one that shows East Hartford. There was no redlining map of the 1930s for Bloomfield at this time, but real estate agents and bankers specifically might have made similar determinations. These maps have a lot of attention today. You can look on the covers of several books. I was going to pull one off my shelf, but I don't have, oh, here you have it. Here's Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law. And so these redlining maps that were very secretive in the 1930s and not even discovered really by historians until the 1970s and not widely publicized till even just the past 10 years. I went to Washington, D.C. and digitized this map. The redlining maps tell a very painful story of how federal government and private lenders were working together to rate different neighborhoods. Now, rating applications for mortgages or similar type things, that's not a problem. That's perfectly legal. But when people are rating an entire neighborhood, regardless of the credit worthiness of the individual resident or the value of that individual's home or proposed home they're going to buy, but when you're assigning a risk value to an entire neighborhood based on the social composition of that neighborhood, well, that's how we got the way named redlining today. The redlining maps rated the areas based on the mortgage lender's determination of the social composition of who was living there and where they thought the best bet was for lending, green, down to blue, down to yellow, and down to red. And if we look through how those ratings were made, and we can even go into the way the forms were created, looking at asking the raters, what's the social composition of percentage of foreign-born families, percentage of, in the language of the 1930s, the percentage of the Negro families living there. Is there an infiltration of any groups? How many relief families, or language of the 1930s again, families living on government assistance are there?
This is when we can sort of reconstruct and see what the actual redlining maps look like. And we look at the commentary along with them. Here is this is an interactive version of a redlining map we made. And if I click on this area here, people think of this as the Blue Hills area, section B5. And it will open up actually the rating that was made at the time. You can see that federal government agents were looking at the composition of who lived there and using actually derogatory language as well, racist language at the time, saying it's a somewhat newer section, quote, that extends into the town of Bloomfield, but, quote, it's largely given over to the Hebrew race, referring to, this is a Christian Protestant raiders, referring to Jews moving in a derogatory way, although these, quote, better class Italians are also moving there now. So this is part of the history of federal lending being shaped by the composition of who's there. Now, as painful as those redlining maps are, I argue, and many historians also argue, that they actually didn't shape as much as you might think compared to other types of federal programs that don't have fancy color-coded maps. The Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, had a much more boring way of rating neighborhoods, and they had referred to something called the FHA Underwriting Manual. And this very much was sort of a document that for an application to be considered for an FHA loan, which lasted a much longer time than that program associated with the redlining maps, these FHA loans, it came down very much to the location of the property and whether there were adverse influences of other, in the language of its time, inharmonious racial or ethnic groups living together. Plain English, if you were a white person living in a predominantly white neighborhood and were having built or trying to get a loan for new construction housing, you were much more likely to get an FHA loan. And that very much determined a lot of who ended up where in our housing today, including places like Bloomfield. So those redlining maps are powerful, but they were just tagged to this HOLC program, which lasted just a few years. It's that Federal Housing Administration program that continues onward. That's the one that actually did a lot more damage to our segregations today. At the same time, in the 1940s, we have a history of race restrictive covenants happening in suburban towns that was surprising when my students and I uncovered this history. Inside the property deed would be often a phrase for some properties or some developments. I'll read one. This is a housing development in 1940 in West Hartford. Quote, no persons of any race except the white race shall use or occupy any building on any lot, except that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy by domestic servants of a different race employed by an owner or tenant. So built into the property deed was a race restrictive covenant that was actually perfectly legal according to Connecticut laws and US Supreme Court laws until 1948. We have mapped out where a lot of these property deeds were. That was a worrying one here. This was in the High Ledge Homes development in West Hartford. Another colleague of mine has spotted several of these in Manchester, Connecticut. I've seen anecdotal references to some of these in Bloomfield and other areas. I haven't had the time or energy to dig through the property records to find them, but my colleague David Ware just got a law passed with state legislators in 2021. Although these restrictive covenants have been unenforceable since the 1948 Shelley versus Kramer decision by the US Supreme Court, they still are on the books today. There still could be a race restrictive covenant or a religious restrictive covenant in a property deed. Now, even though it can't be enforced, many people want these things removed. I don't want them swept under the historical rug, so to speak. So we're pleased that the new law allows individual homeowners through their towns to actually have the race or religious restrictive covenants stricken from the record, but still preserved for history. So this is another mechanism that's been used over time to shape who lives where. And certainly debates over public housing and who could live there surprise a lot of my students today. A lot of my students associate public housing with clearly low-income people, but especially disproportionately Black and brown people today, since that's the way my students have identified public housing. But what they're surprised by is to find out that during World War II, a lot of public housing that's created is actually reserved for white people, white wartime workers in places like West Hartford and elsewhere.
And we have examples of wartime, sometimes meant to be temporary, sometimes turned into more permanent public housing for wartime workers and others related to this that was created in places like West Hartford and other places. And we can see very explicit in the record, West Hartford residents with their political officials, with their elected leaders, fought very hard and succeeded to block African Americans from living in federally subsidized wartime housing. Sometimes they would come up with a compromise where the federal government would be pushing for, we need to open this to African American workers, and local officials in West Hartford would win a compromise that said, only if the Black workers lived there prior to their job in West Hartford's factories. So a lot of these places, this history needs to be uncovered today. In addition to all of these housing history about explicitly racial covenants, I'm also trying to get people aware more about how exclusion through zoning lines has happened. And very much, I think this is a very important case to understand for Connecticut, because in my argument here, I think there's actually more exclusion we see through these non-racially explicit zoning lines that we need to bring more to the surface. And there's a number of organizations today, the Connecticut Fair Housing Center, the Open Communities Alliance, and Desegregate CT are among 3 of the nonprofit advocacy groups that are trying to bring more awareness about the ways that exclusionary zoning ordinances in different towns, as allowed by the state, have shaped Connecticut. West Hartford was actually the first municipality in Connecticut to get state permission to create exclusionary zoning to define who could live where, who could build what kinds of buildings where. And the dispute started in 1923, 1924, when a Jewish grocer wanted to build a grocery store in West Hartford in a location where West Hartford said, residents and town officials said, no, we don't want you to build a grocery store there. But the Jewish grocer, Goldberg, and his family showed that they had followed all the building codes. Why couldn't they build it if they actually had an architect who built it to the design codes at that time? So when West Hartford realized they weren't going to win that case, they found that there was a way to create more strict rules for what kinds of properties could be constructed in different towns. And so West Hartford officials like Josiah Woods, who was a town councilman at the time, created a zoning plan with experts brought in, where the design of the zoning very much was to eliminate mixtures of single-family homes and multifamily homes, and to make it uneconomic to build multifamily homes in large portions of West Hartford. Now, there's nothing about race explicitly in the zoning laws of Connecticut, which is why they still are with us today. But many of the people who created the zoning laws, who were brought in even from other cities to help be consultants for this, had a very clear racial record of what they're trying to do. And you certainly can see the socioeconomics of it in their types of plans. West Hartford and other towns afterwards divided up their areas into different zones. The simplest way this is called at times like zones A through E. And the intended use was you had to have a minimum amount of land for one family. So a one-family home could only be built on 9,000 square feet in Zone A, and that, of course, would drive up the cost of land per family. Those multifamily homes or apartment buildings were only allowed in Zones D and E. So what going forward with this was the zoning planners very much wanted to make it, and their language was to make it uneconomic for developers to build multifamily housing in areas that they didn't want it to occur in. So if we look at apartment buildings and so forth that were being created just before zoning in 1924, this is Farmington Avenue in West Hartford. These, zoning was always forward-looking. It never restricted buildings once they were built, but this is the kind of construction that the zoning advocates wanted to stop. If we look forward into the very first zoning maps, here's West Hartford in 1924, and we can see that most of the land that hadn't even been built on yet, that A zone and that B zone, that was being restricted only for economically one family, single family housing. I think what's important about this for looking forward to other towns is that while places like West Hartford were the first to leap forward with zoning, we see that zoning policies take off in the 1950s in many towns across Connecticut. Nearly every town is creating a planning and zoning agency, as shown in this photo here.
And if we look at the growing population of just 3 towns, as you know, Bloomfield has a tremendous population growth in the 1950s. It's one of the peak periods of growth for Connecticut. Just floating down here, we can see that Bloomfield and Avon made even more restrictive zoning areas in some locations that were not yet developed. Bloomfield was looking at basically 1 acre of land for a single family home in its R40 areas. Avon was requiring 2 acres of land for a 1-family home in its eastern zone. This is in the mid-1950s. Now remember, just because you zone something with rules that way, it doesn't mean it will always be built that way. Developers may choose to either build or not build there. So zoning doesn't dictate that housing will be built there, but it certainly sets the rules for how housing could be built over time. And I think it's important to see just in these comparative maps of how different suburbs were sort of like competing against each other to come up with even more exclusive areas to try to recruit upper income families to live in their particular towns in the 1950s and 60s, especially into the 70s as well. I have a section of the book that it's not finished yet about selling and shopping the lines, and I'm going to jump over to just a couple portions about that in a subchapter here. So it's not in the chapter 4 yet, but it's in a different back of the book because I had to write an essay about this for another purpose. Let me just jump there. When I look at the 1950s and 60s, I'm interested in looking at who's selling homes and how are they selling homes. And one thing that my students and I noticed when we did studies of different real estate ads, we'd look through the first Sunday newspaper in May in 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, and so forth. And we'd look to see who was advertising homes and how. And we were surprised to count up in some suburbs, in particular West Hartford, the name of the school, the public school, elementary school attendance area was often built into the ad. So it's something that is striking now because we can see that someone who's selling a private good, 48 Pioneer Drive, a privately owned home that you can purchase, they're actually advertising you can buy access into a more desirable public school district. And this is a very interesting mixture of private goods and public goods that we have in the United States that sort of explains how we got in the position we're in today. A lot of suburban homes end up being sold because of their accessibility or their property rights were located within public school zones that were seen as more desirable. And certainly as we look at areas like Bloomfield, we've done a number of oral histories with people who have discussed more about steering, racial steering, about who could and couldn't find a home in different areas. My students think of real estate as like, well, anyone can buy anything anywhere, but I have to show them, well, if we look closely in the 1950s and 60s, it's not even a secret. It's quite open knowledge that different racial groups, ethnic groups, religious groups are steered in certain directions by agreements among real estate agents in sort of the real estate boards that exist at the time. And there are real estate decisions that are made to open up certain areas only to certain people of different populations when there's so much pressure that they need to create some area to make sales to happen. We spoke with Spencer Shaw, who at the time was one of the first of his generation of Hartford middle-class residents. He was employed at the library to be able to buy a home in Bloomfield in the early 1960s, where it was a very contested case. Real estate agents were debating whether or not to show him that home. And in his story, he very much describes that when he bought that home from a Greek couple, within 2 or 3 months, 4 or 5 other families moved out. We spoke with other activists and people in Bloomfield. This is Adele Wright and others who were organizing with Bloomfield's Human Relations Commission and so forth, and very much trying to have a ban, a partly successful ban against for sale or sold signs in front of private homes because of the blockbusting that was happening in Bloomfield. Blockbusting is the concept when unscrupulous real estate agents are intentionally going into neighborhoods and spreading the word that a different racial or ethnic group is going to be buying in there soon. And so current residents, often white residents, should try to sell now. Real estate agents might go to a homeowner in a section of Bloomfield and say, your house is worth $10,000 today, it's only going to be worth $8,000 tomorrow. They would influence the white family to try to sell fast. And then often real estate agents would turn over with that $8,000 home they purchased and sell it for $12,000 to an African-American family moving in. So this is a process of blockbusting that happened other places. And I think what Bloomfield deserves more credit for is its attempt to fight against blockbusting. The other portion of this I refer to here is in this chapter. I'm going to jump over now to challenging the power lines. And I know we're at 3:35, so if you give me a couple more minutes here on challenging the power lines. I think an important story here is about the people who mobilized against racial steering and redlining. A lot of these factors have happened to us, but I'm also trying to make sure we bring to the light the stories of people who are organizing to rally against what's happening here. One of the groups, along with the Bloomfield group, that gets a lot of deserves more attention is a group, Education/Instrucción. These are the leaders at the time in the 1970s, Boyd Hines, Julia Ramos McKay, and Ben Dixon, who also was involved in Bloomfield schooling for a while. What they were trying to do was one of the first groups in the area to do what we call taking real estate racism to court through testing. So testing involved training dozens of Black, white, and Puerto Rican couples to become testers. They would pose as clients, walk into different real estate agents with the same script, tell us about what kinds of communities and homes are available at this certain price range. The testers would listen or sometimes secretly tape record those conversations and write down detailed notes of how real estate agents steered them in different areas or only agreed to show them certain homes. So they had about 100 different activists, maybe some people on the call were involved in this, who produced hundreds of pages of testimony that was admitted into a famous court case. In the court case is called the U.S. versus Barrows case, because the U.S. federal government, after the 1968 Civil Rights Act, took up this case and argued that, yes, 7 out of the 8 largest real estate firms in the entire metropolitan area, 7 out of the 8 were seen as clearly in violation of the Fair Housing Act by steering white couples to many suburban neighborhoods and steering African-American and Puerto Rican couples only into Hartford or only into selected suburbs such as portions of Bloomfield or later portions of Windsor. So this was a successful lawsuit for civil rights activists in the sense that the 7 real estate agent firms finally agreed to settle, but it very much was a slap on the wrist. The activists were upset that the U.S. federal government didn't impose penalties, financial penalties on these firms. Rather, the settlement agreed that real estate agents would be trained to avoid racial steering. So that's kind of like part of the culture of real estate today. But there's certainly, my students are always wondering how people work around and get around that today. So I'm going to pause there to be sensitive to my time. And there's more pieces in the chapter of the book about schooling and struggles over that today, with some in Bloomfield and some in the metropolitan Hartford area. We're aware of many school integration activists and families who are trying to change these boundary lines. I've emphasized a bit more today the housing side of things because I try to lay that groundwork to help explain how school integration activists were mobilizing against the rigid segregation that exists in schools, to set that as a backdrop. So Mara, I'm going to pause there.
Thank you. It was fascinating. Does anybody have any questions? Please unmute yourself or put it into the chat.
And while you're thinking of questions, remember, I've got my pad of paper here. The reason I put out this book now, even though it's not finished, is it gets better with constructive feedback from people who have lived this history or have insights that they'd like to share about what.
The book isn't out yet then.
Well, think of it this way. It's not finished, but it's out there. Anyone can read the book, and a lot of people do, and a lot of people send me emails saying you should be doing this or this, and some of those incorporations I work into the book.
Where is it available?
So I'll put in the chat, just so everybody's got it here. You can see the link. And where'd my chat go? Yep. Everything I showed you today
is publicly available in that link in the chat. That's the On the Line book that we're looking at right now. I'll just go back so you can see. Well, people have been seeing the main cover for it already.
Thank you, Jack. Susan has a question for you.
Is there some kind of law or requirement now that towns have to have a certain amount of what they call affordable housing? And is there some kind of trick that they use where it doesn't really make equity, like just because it's affordable housing?
Susan, what you're referring to is a long struggle over activists and some towns that have been cooperative, some towns have not been cooperative, and the state that has sort of had mixed opinions about this, about what laws will for mandating some percentage of affordable housing. Many people refer to this by the listing that appears in the state statute as number 8-30G, which 830G, talk about things encoded that way. It's too much inside baseball in my view. So I just feel like it was like struggles over affordable housing and laws that go with that. I think that you're onto something here. There's been various efforts by different local and state officials to try to pressure more towns to put up their fair share of affordable housing. But the way this is defined, it gets challenging. One of the things is that your definition of what's affordable will vary based on your demographics. So there's no statewide definition of what's affordable housing. The Avon's definition, East Hartford's definition, and Bridgeport's definition of what's considered fair housing is based on the things like the median income of people who currently live in those communities. So that may not be the best way to define what affordable housing is. The second thing is that you may have seen recently, there's been news stories that the state has required more towns to show what plans they'll have to reach affordable housing goals. And many towns in Connecticut, including the one I live in right now, West Hartford, has missed that deadline. I think it's more than 50 towns, I believe, have not complied with the state law to sort of like show what their plan is to make more affordable housing everywhere. That's the problem that is maybe if we have laws without teeth in them. Certainly there are a number of activists with, as I said, organizations such as the Connecticut Fair Housing Center, the Open Communities Alliance, which has a lawsuit against one of the towns in Connecticut that has they've argued is actively fought against affordable housing, and the Desegregate CT groups as well. They're much more up to date, and I encourage people who are interested in these present day issues to connect with any of those groups, since as people point out, I'm more likely to know about things that happened 50 years ago than what's happening right now sometimes.
And another question is, if there's not affordable housing, people have been innovative and they like breaking down a house. Like I think years ago on Prospect Avenue, I'm not sure if it was on the Hartford side or the West Hartford side, people were living in a big house, but they weren't married. They weren't one married family, so they made them not able to do that. And I think nuns were living in a house and they also penalized them. Can they get away with doing that, or is there a way around that?
I think if towns are defining families in very restrictive terms, that certainly can limit who could live in some of these houses. I think, Susan, the one you're referring to is on Scarborough Street, which is just it's in the west end of Hartford near Prospect Ave. A group of people there took one of the large mansions that existed, which would be hard for any small family today to actually use. And they renovated the house. It was in very poor condition. They put a lot of their money into it, but they also made a legal document showing how it wasn't just a traditional nuclear family, but it was a group of different individuals who legally own the house together. The city of Hartford and its agencies fought them for a number of years. There's a lot of bad publicity for Hartford about that, since the homeowner's argument was, if we aren't putting the money into this, who else is? And so there right now, that multiple family on Scarborough Street is living there today. I think that other places are trying to figure out what to do, and that's, the housing differs from place to place. I think there's an interesting examples to be seen elsewhere in other cities are struggling with this as well, other metropolitan areas. In Minneapolis, Minnesota, for example, large portions of their land were all zoned as single family housing only, like a lot of suburbs are in Connecticut.
And the Minneapolis went through and said, we need to find more ways to make this community more affordable so that people can afford to live here and participate in our economy. Since if only a few people can afford to live here, we're not going to have a tax base that's going to be sustainable. So Minneapolis and other places have rezoned areas that were previously single family only to allow more, especially larger homes, to be divided into 2-person units, or new construction to have duplexes or triples as well.
Jack, I wanted to read from Daryl Harris. He wrote, I just saw my life unfold before me. I knew Spencer. I happen to know Spencer too. And his brother, Dawson Shaw. What effect did housing have on the GI Bill on Blacks? My dad had a white lawyer buy our home in Bloomfield. I went from Wish School in Hartford to Blue Hill School in Bloomfield in 1964.
Great. Thanks very much, Mayor, for bringing that one to attention here. And the first name on this is Harris's.
Daryl is his first name.
Daryl Harris. Thank you very much. I think certainly African Americans who were in the segregated armed forces during World War II, those who did receive GI Bill benefits coming back, had a problem, because you could certainly have a GI Bill benefit for housing or something like that. But if you were relying on the FHA or the VA loans for where you could get homes, that's a problem, because the system was set up so that FHA loans and VA loans made it difficult for anyone to move into racially mixed areas and get one of those loans. If there was evidence of racially inharmonious groups living near each other, what we call a racially mixed area or an integrated neighborhood today, you were likely to get rejected for one of those loans. And so even if you're granted the privilege of one of those loans for your veteran service, whether you could use it or not, it was one big question as well. He refers to, my dad had a white lawyer buy our home in Bloomfield, and this practice of shell buying is quite common. I'd like to be able to document more cases of that. So if Mr. Harris wants to get in touch with me, I'll put my email in the chat as well. For anyone's welcome to email me, especially if you got ideas, or if you want your story, help us record your story, whether in print or otherwise. Shell buying is what happens when real estate agents are banding together in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. It's quite open that they are not selling properties, or not acknowledging those selling properties to middle-class African Americans or Puerto Ricans who can afford to buy them, but they aren't being shown those properties. So often a sympathetic white lawyer or a civil rights ally might be buying the home as a first buyer and then selling it in transaction to somebody else, therefore bypassing the real estate agent's firm grip on racial steering in the area. And of course, that affects who goes to what types of schools, as Mr. Harris said.
If you want to go to Joseph's comment on chat, I can read it. You made no mention of the bishops of the banking and insurance community who drew up a plan called Greater Hartford Process to plan where people of color should live in the region. When it was made public, it was the start of the insurance and banking leaders withdrawing from their role as stewards of the region.
Exactly right, Joseph. Thank you very much. And I love it when people are making good comments about what should be in there as well. You're right. I don't have a section on the bishops of the banking and insurance industry who were drawing up plans at that time. The Greater Hartford Process is stunning today to people who see that we have occasional documents of a plan by some leaders to try to persuade and move African American and Puerto Rican residents out of the city of Hartford to rural outlying towns like Coventry, and to sort of like to move people. This is, never fully happened, but these were, documents of plans at the time in this late 60s and early 70s that threw the Greater Hartford planning process into disarray, with a lot of controversy surrounding what its underlying motivations might be. I think what's interesting about it was, looking back, at least there was an attempt to call something a Greater Hartford planning process. Certainly a large portion of what happens today is we have a number of towns in Connecticut, Bloomfield, East Hartford, West Hartford, and so forth. And we have a state government, and we don't really have county government anymore. That was dissolved by Connecticut in the 1960s. Hartford County never really did that much anyway, since the Connecticut was settled primarily as colonial towns. We have a Capital Region Council of Governments, CROG, which we're required to have for the area to accept some federal grants, especially for highway transportation planning, which is regional by definition. But many people are saying, what could we do to have more regional planning? Tom Condon, a longtime Hartford current journalist who now writes for the Connecticut Mirror, has certainly a number of essays over recent years saying, look at the ways that there is informally some regional cooperation happening across towns, and could it be more economically efficient for towns to be collaborating together? Could we be a larger economic driver and more just provider for housing for more people if there was more collaboration, like the Greater Hartford process?
Yeah. Can we go next to Don Noel, who's had his hand up for a while? Thank you, Don, for your patience.
And Don, good to see you again. Love to hear your comments.
Nice to see you, Jack. Thank you. First rate talk, and I thought I was pretty knowledgeable in this field, and I've learned a great deal. So thank you for that. By the way, Peter Labossi's obit was in the paper just this week. Peter was the one who led the Greater Hartford process. I put my hand up because I wanted to mention to you that there was an organized effort of line buyers, straw buyers. It was organized by Pat Ritter, who was the grandmother of today's Speaker of the House. Largely Quakers, although not entirely, but we would go out in the suburbs and buy houses that a Black family wanted. And then I can't remember the legality, but we turned it over to Pat Ritter's organization, and they turned it over to the Black family. And in the midst of that, she became aware of the white flight from Blue Hills and encouraged. We moved in thinking that we were of some modest prominence to the point we thought maybe we would stabilize some of the white families. It didn't really last very long, and I think we were about the last family to move in until Boyd and Wendy Hines moved in next door some years later. But within the next few years, the remaining white population of Blue Hills moved out mostly to West Hartford, the Jewish population to the north end of West Hartford. And I don't think at that point it was blockbusting. I think it was just plain old white flight.
Yeah, Brad, I'm sorry, Don, very good to hear you, and in memory of your wife, Brad. Both of you have contributed a lot to this history, and Don certainly, as a journalist for decades and continuing to write today, certainly continues to do this. I've seen references to Pat Ritter and doing a number of housing-oriented activism. I am trying to find more either documents or people who want to record that history, an oral history, or write down their memories of it. And so I'd love to find more examples of straw buyers, or as you said, networks of activists who are trying to support straw buying. So if that's something that you can help me lead me to, so we can get more of that history, sort of like saving that history before it disappears on all of us, I think that's an important chapter to tell. And very much the, as you said, a number of families who were fighting against the forces of real estates and lenders, white families who were trying to integrate areas intentionally with African Americans and others. That's a story that I'd like to tell more of as well.
Let me give it a thought. Maybe I can find you some names.
Yep, and once again, my email's in the chat there. Always feel free to send me ideas, send me a link. I can't always promise that I can get a student to do an oral history in person with someone, but nowadays I have to admit, with Zoom and things like this, if people are willing, I can set up an oral history interview between one of my students who's got some background on this and a participant. And sometimes if everyone's willing to have that recorded, we can make that history saved for others. I should mention here that thanks to librarians across the state, we now have the Connecticut Digital Archives, which is sponsored at University of Connecticut. And that's been great to sort of like take lots of these documents and sources and photographs and even videos, and being able to sort of having people like me and others digitize those, but making sure that they're shared collectively for long-term use. So most everything in my book is ending up in the Connecticut Digital Archive as well. If you aren't familiar with it, check it with your friendly librarians.
So we're coming to the close of our talk. Are there any other final questions before we end?
Can I share just one other piece, and maybe it might be a way to close out here?
Absolutely.
Great. So I wanted to make sure we had time for questions and comments, which I'm grateful for. I've got a lot of notes on my pad, and also Mara, if you'd be willing to make sure that the chat, if you can make sure that that is copied and pasted and emailed to me, that would be very helpful if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
But I'll also do this here is I'm just going to go back to share my screen for 1 minute, and this may help also realize the possibility of things. We know so much history is captured on television, and historians like me, we don't work with TV that well. In fact, the TV networks in the Hartford area don't really make it easy for people to access their archives and so forth, because they were running a business. They were trying to sort of like get footage shown. They never really expected to become a historical archive for how America lived and so forth. So whenever I'm able to do something like this, I'm quite thrilled, because this is where having a digital book actually is better than just a print-only book. I'm going to jump now to the Jumping the School District Line chapter that I've written with a couple of students. It's referring back into Bloomfield in 1984. There is a nationally prominent case. It involves a mother living in Hartford, Sandra Foster. She's African-American. She's searching for a better school for her teenage son. She and 3 other families, quote, jump the line. They enroll their students who reside in the city of Hartford in the suburban school district of Bloomfield in 1980s. And this is very much, they're doing this without permission. They're signing it up through a relative or something like this. This had happened for decades. In the 1950s and 60s, we see many cases of families who were jumping the line, sometimes living in the rural towns of Connecticut and jumping the line, claiming that they lived in the city of Hartford, where the best schooling was for many years. And at other times, families that were, for one reason or another, living in Hartford, but wanted to send their children to Bloomfield schools in the 1960s. And when these issues came up previously, they were always handled as sort of like school administrative decisions. There'd be a hearing, there would be a decision, somebody would be moved in or out of a school district, or it would be adjudicated in some way. What happened in Bloomfield that made it national news and sort of set the tone for a lot of today was Sandra Foster and her others were arrested by Bloomfield Police Department and prosecuted for a period of time in state court for stealing an education. And the challenge to this was a number of public school activists said, if the Constitution of Connecticut guarantees free and equal public education, how could it be stolen by moving from one line to another? It must mean there's something about the lines that are restricting and violating the Constitution to begin with. So I just want to close out here. This is a brief television excerpt, and this is what
this issue goes to the heart
we can see today.
The Supreme Court decision. What these parents have exposed is a 2-tier educational system. In the 4th poorest city in the nation, in the face of the insurance capital of the Western world, these parents have exposed indeed a contradiction.
So just jumping forward briefly here is
Most major
this is a
urban
local
centers.
television broadcast about this issue with a focus on Bloomfield, Connecticut.
In April 1985, 4 parents, Sandra Foster, Elizabeth Brown, Claude Johnson, and Norma Wright, were arrested for sending their children across town lines to Bloomfield High School.
So back to the broader purpose here is, as you know, many of us grew up with this or saw the change happen. Television became a place where these where stories were told, in addition to the newspapers, the Hartford Times, the Hartford Courant, and others, and trying to capture how television news told these stories, what narratives they showed or didn't show, who was interviewed and who wasn't, what kind of questions were posed to people, making sure those sources come alive as well. It's very hard for me to write about these television excerpts without having at least small clips inserted in here. And thanks to the way that copyright law is written, I can put in small clips under fair use guidelines in the body of the book here, write about them, writing commentary about them. And in some cases, I'm able to actually point to longer clips of these that may be actually in an informal archive on YouTube somewhere, or maybe an official archive like the Connecticut Digital Archives. So I think to tell our story, we need to look more closely at what sources we're looking at, whose stories are being told, and how do we help all of us see these hidden boundary lines that have divided us and created us who we are, and how are people trying to cross those lines? I'll close with that.
This was fantastic, Jack. Wonderful talk, very informative. Patty said that, very informative, informational, and you've taught us all a lot. And we look forward to getting your book when it's in hard copy in our library and
Great.
probably the Historical Center too. So thank you very much for doing this for us. And thank you to everybody who came today. And if you have questions about anything about the Bloomfield Public Library, feel free to contact me, Mara, or Allison Wilkos. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.